who are leading the scholar strike are actually encouraging all of us to do alternative teach-ins, to actually talk about what's going on in the country. And so this event this morning, I think, is the ideal event that actually not only is meeting at this time, but really part of a teach-in that's looking at how we move beyond what we find right now. And we've always believed, I know all of you know this, but let me re-emphasize it, that labor, including and especially cooperative businesses, are ways of not only addressing the racism of the society, but to fight it and to overcome it. So glad we're all here and great to be in solidarity.
Thank you. Great. Thank you so much. And I'll hand it over to Aaron now.
Well, good morning, and thanks everyone for being here. As Rosemarie said, we've got a packed calendar this morning. So I'm looking forward to having these discussions with Bianca and then with Nathan. If you look on the agenda, which I sent to you last week, and I think Rosemarie, well, no, I sent to you last week, and now I'm going to put it in the chat for everyone. There's a couple of items that I just kind of wanted to highlight again. A lot of you have done these things, which is really wonderful. Many of you have signed up for readings and then also signed up for presentations. That's that second item there, the like signing up for when you can present on a reading under item B in the calendar for the fall is probably the most really the most pressing. We've got lots of interesting things for you to read and to look through. And again, as you'll see these, as I sort of demonstrate in a few minutes, these presentations aren't, full academic papers. They're more just reflections on what it is that you're learning and how it is that you're challenging your own self and growing within this work. Particularly if we recall the heart of this project, right, is figuring out how it is that the work in worker cooperatives relates to the work of the church. And so how does it we can sort of bring those two together? And so many of these readings, I think, lend themselves naturally to that. So again, just kind of, not sort of, just I'm trying to, this isn't a full-on academic paper, as I said, just sort of reflections on what it is that you're thinking about and you're learning and you're challenging. And for many of you, for those of you who are more theologically inclined, absolutely, let's think that depth. And for those of you who have a wide breadth of experience in other areas, from union organizing to building cooperatives yourselves, those are the sort of experiences that we're wanting to draw from. So those are just some items, again, just to remind you to sign up for within the bibliography, and then also to sign up for a reading to present on a reading in that calendar for the fall. The final item, which I've gotten from the vast majority of you, again, is just the video and photo release document. We're just doing that, again, to kind of keep these logistical items in front of you so that we can make sure that we've got all of our bases covered. Do we have any questions, again, on the bibliography? Some of this, George, for you, this is going to be very new, obviously. But for others, do you have any questions about the bibliography signups and questions about the calendar for the fall? We feel good? Okay.
I have one question, Aaron. Will you assign us when the presentations are due, or do we? That's what I'm not quite clear about. I've signed up for a book, but when is it going to be presented?
This is great. That's the heart of the question. I'm asking for you to select a slot. I'm not gonna assign that. Okay. So, for example, we can look at October, and we see that our first October meeting on Tuesday, October 6th is open. So if you want to do it on October 6th, sign up for that. Of course, first come, first serve. So if there's a conflict, we can, two people really want to do it on October 6th. That's great. And then I'm looking down further on the calendar, November 3rd and the 17th. The vast majority of these are still open. So that's what I'm looking for. Does that make sense? Is that clear?
Yeah, got it. Thanks.
Yeah. Great. Okay, so one of the things that I am going to talk about this morning is just a brief overview of Nathan Schneider's book, Everything for Everyone, and touch on a little bit his article, Truly Much Can Be Done, which was sent to you all last week. It looks like, I know that I just want to acknowledge this too, that Benny signed up for Everything for Everyone. That's a little bit where I just didn't recognize that, but it looks like he's offered generously to read another book. So that's great. We can, there's ample things for all of us to read and to share, which is great. So maybe just a brief introduction to it. I had never read any Nathan Schneider before. I don't know if any of you had heard of him before. I lived in New York around the time when Occupy, and I think George was there too, when Occupy was first starting. George and I went to seminary around the same time. He was a year or two ahead of me. I can't quite remember. But so both of us, I guess all three of us, Nathan, myself, and George were all around Occupy. I remember going down often to Zuccotti Park and participating in protests and sort of just feeling the energy at that spot. That's where Nathan Schneider really got his start, and he kind of gives you a little bit of reflection about how he began to think about journalism, the economy, economic democracy, and cooperatives all together, and particularly religion too. He's got this interesting vantage point because he himself is Catholic. So he kind of gives that genesis about how he started to think about the intersection of all these elements around that time because of the questions that Occupy forced within people's minds. And he is now a professor of media studies and technology at University of Colorado at Boulder, which is particularly interesting for him to continue this relationship of technology, religion, and democracy in a media studies position, right? To be thinking about religion in this sort of way. And it's helpful for us to see how it is that he weaves religion into these conversations. So this emphasis on the relationship between technology, economic democracy, primarily in the forms of worker cooperatives and other forms of cooperatives, and technology really permeates the entire book. The story that he's telling within this book is, at least so far as I read it, and others of you who have read it, I know Rosemary and I think Jorg have read it, others of you have read it too, correct me if I'm wrong here, is sort of looking and making retelling the story of cooperatives back from its genesis within the late 1800s, the mid 1800s. He's retelling that story in order to provide an account of their relevance for today, right? To say that this is a long tradition that is now sort of getting started again because of the sort of contractions within the economy about how the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, and we need to find ways to sort of steer and correct the economy. And he thinks that cooperatives are the way to do that. What he's particularly interested in, when I think of sort of contractions with the economy, is the massive advances within technological sectors of the economy. Automation, the fact of he's very interested in sort of computers and sort of hacking the general approach about how it is that the financialization of the economy too tends to take the economy away from sort of real material and sort of isolates it within financial markets. And he thinks that worker cooperatives and other forms of cooperatives can adjust to that sort of shifts within technology and also democratically distribute and the profits and hold things accountable to this. So he gives many examples about how it is that there are cooperative movements within Italy and Spain and France that all arise from sort of hacker communities. And how it is that he has a fair amount of reflection on the role of Bitcoin and all this stuff that is kind of goes over my head, partly because that's its whole other conversation. But I guess all that I'm really trying to emphasize here is the role that worker cooperatives can have in an increasingly economy that's that's grounded in financialization and is advancing with technology. At the end of the day, though, I think that part of this sort of focus on technology too needs to be grounded in the fact that the economy is undeniably material, right? There are real sort of material limits to the economy. So there is one exchange where he's talking with an individual who's trying to start essentially to invent a whole other monetary system outside of capitalism and grounded in the sense of the commons, where things are shared between the workers and democratically shared. Nathan relates this experience about how it's at 4 o'clock in the morning. He's talking with this hacker who's been up all night thinking and trying to create all this stuff to sort of build this alternative economic model. And Nathan reflects how he's going, deep into the history of the commons in the 1800s and 1900s. And the hacker then says, I'm not interested in the commons for like thinkers. I'm interested in the commons, creating an alternative commons for those who need to share things, who really need this. And so that was a helpful sort of exchange, I thought, that sort of grounds and reemphasizes the work that we need to be doing, which is not to just think theory for theory's sake, but to hold it accountable to workers and to communities that are struggling. And so I thought that was a good sort of reflection that can help us sort of keep ourselves honest, keep ourselves grounded to real people's experiences, and not merely kind of think about these thoughts for their own sake. I know that's a sort of just a small story that kind of struck me. I think the book and his conversation later this afternoon will be really fascinating, and he's got a real depth of knowledge about the history of cooperatives and how they can work in our economy today. And I think that we'll have a lot of different experiences to relate to him. But I hope that's a very quick overview of just sort of my impressions about his interests and what he brings to the table at this sort of intersection of religion, technology, and worker cooperatives. Does that make sense? That was kind of quick and offhand, but I really enjoyed it. So I don't want to take up any more time off of that, and we'll have him later this afternoon. But now it would make sense, I think, to kind of turn it back to Rosemarie and for us to, unless we want to, do we have any other questions about Nathan or about that book or his interests or things like that?
I haven't read the book, but could you tell me more about the hackers and like what's going on with hackers talking to each other about cooperating?
Yeah, so the way that he tells this story is that there's a rich tradition of worker cooperatives within northern Italy. And Italy itself the government has sort of put heft behind developing worker cooperatives. And they've seen this primarily within, and they've tried to support sort of hacker communities. And when I think of hacker here, I don't think of just like one individual behind a computer. I think of an individual, like a collective group of people who are using technology to solve complex problems. I think that's his definition of what hacking is, right? It's not a sense of like trying to crack a code, but people using computers to solve some economic problems that are really difficult. So he gives some examples and tells stories about how it is that these new hacking communities, one example being a new community within northern Italy, are supported by the government to solve some of these complex economic difficulties, and are doing it based on models that are deeply cooperative in this way, which also draw from Nathan's Catholic, from the experience of monasteries, sort of transforming the economy within medieval times through feudalism, right? Sort of the role that monasteries have in sort of reforming and shaping the economic way of life. So he's interested in them because of their, their economic relevance, but also the connection that they have to previous transformations within economic ways of life that are supported by the Catholic Church. A second example would be that these hacker communities are doing some of the most radical things. He gives an example about an individual from Spain who ended up essentially like stealing from a bunch of, I'm not going to explain it very well, but stealing from a bunch of banks, getting loans and not paying the loans back, but taking the loans and then giving them to causes that he supported it. So then it because he sees that capitalism essentially just rips people off. And by taking that lesson, he then thinks, okay, well, let's think of alternative ways of lending, alternative ways of currencies that don't rely upon capitalism's understanding of debt and capitalist understanding of currency and money itself. And so this individual, this hacker is, thinking of entities called Fair Co-op. All of these are virtual too, online. Fair Co-op, and then Fair Lending, and then I think Fair Currency. All these different, like a full-on economic way of getting money and lending money and starting, using capital and in a way to generate an economic system similar to Bitcoin. Technological, open, accountable to everyone, but is outside of capitalist way of indebting individuals, right? So I think I know that's kind of, it took me a little bit to kind of like really, it's one of the technology chapter is like one of the longer chapters in it, and I think this is what really interests Nathan, is because it is the most in-depth form of building an economic way of life outside of capitalism's reach, and doing it in a way that is the most provocative by actually sort of, because I think the amount of loans today, this was done in the 90s, and the amount of money that was like stolen essentially was around $300,000 if not $500,000. So it was a fair amount of money that this guy was able to get loans from and then not pay back. Of course, he's then like, he moved to Brazil, and then it's like clandestine, like he's, hiding from the police and all of this. So it's a very interesting, it's just an entertaining story. But it's, yeah. And it's still, if you look up, I think it's faircoop. If you just Google it, you'll find that it's still, that it's live, that it's running, that it's possible for you to kind of like buy in and be a part of it. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Yeah, that was interesting. Yeah, interesting book. He's got a lot of connections, that's for sure.
Yeah, and this is all new to me, so I hope I didn't explain it too poorly, but it's interesting.
That was great. Thank you, Aaron. Thank you. Great. Well, I'd like to welcome Bianca Vasquez, and I'm really excited to introduce Bianca to you today. Bianca and I met about 2 years ago at a cooperative developer training, and Bianca is the director of the Beloved Community Incubator in Washington, D.C. She's a community organizer and a cooperative developer. And Bianca helped to build the Beloved Community Incubator on grassroots demands by their very neighbors who are marginalized by the economy. And they were, these neighbors, right, demanded to create jobs that have dignified family sustaining wages. And what's interesting about the Beloved Community Incubator is that they are creating worker cooperatives, and that this work is closely tied to Luther Place Memorial Church. And it's one of the very few churches that we have found in our research doing this kind of work. And so Bianca is really spearheading this evidence-based approach to co-op development, and that's why I'm really excited to have her here today and to have you hear her story and the story of the Beloved Community Incubator, and for us to have some time to ask her some questions and have some discussion. But before we start, I thought it might be good for the CIT members to briefly introduce themselves to Bianca so she can get a sense of who we are. And so could you briefly tell us your name and maybe what organization you're with? And so I'll start. I'm Rosemary Rieger, and I'm with the Southeast Center for Cooperative Development and the point person on this project. And so if you just want to popcorn, jump right in.
I'm Stephen Handy. I pastor an urban church in downtown Nashville called McKendree Methodist Church. I'm also a community activist.
And as we can, I know this Bianca just asked in the chat, if you could reflect on what interests you or excites you about co-ops, and what might it be helpful for you to hear about?
Yeah, that way my time can maybe speak to specifically some of what would be helpful for y'all.
That's great, thanks.
So I serve a very somewhat marginalized community, high levels of poverty and homelessness in downtown Nashville, and one of the few churches that embraces that segment of the population. So we are trying to create an entrepreneurial church model that says no longer will we allow capitalism to dictate. We have control and we should take control. And so we're trying to create models, not a model, of diversity around cooperatives.
Good morning. I'm Benny Overton, co-director with Rosemary of the Southeast Center for Cooperative Development, formerly officer with the UAW Labor Union.
I'm Ellen Peterson, and I'm the executive director of a local nonprofit here called Justice Industries. And we don't create cooperatives, but we create small businesses to employ people who are marginalized, are recovering from addiction, struggle with mental illness, have previously been incarcerated, have barriers to traditional employment. So we create jobs specifically for them, and we have two of our largest programs is a curbside glass recycling program and a mobile car wash that we just started right now. So we have about 10 employees right now providing close to 200 hours worth of work a week. And I'm very interested to learn about your model and how I'm interested in your cost analysis, really, to be honest, more than anything else, about how you make some of that stuff work. Because we do have program revenue that generates enough for the people that work, but it's the overhead of the nonprofit. Just interested in how you price and cost analysis type stuff and how that works for you guys.
My name's Aaron Stauffer. I'm a senior research fellow with the Wedland Cook program at Vanderbilt Divinity, working with York, but I'm also working with Rosemary and Benny at the Southeast Center here on this CIT grant. So I'm primarily interested in just thinking about co-ops as a very realistic way of having workers own the means of production, right? As opposed to thinking of petty sort of abstract ideas. This is a very tangible way of shifting the economy. And I think I'm really interested in thinking through theologically how it is that we can help churches talk about that without scaring people away.
Hi, Bianca. I'm Francisco Garcia, and I'm a PhD student at Vandy in the theology, and also a fellow of the Wedland Cook program, which is connected to this collaborative inquiry grant. And I am interested in, I'm also an Episcopal priest and a former labor organizer, and my ministry context was were mostly in Black and brown community, immigrant community in Los Angeles and California. And so I'm interested in the intersection of cooperatives, worker centers, and faith communities, and how we can think about, yeah, tangible projects in that respect.
I'll try it again. Can you hear me? My name is Vonda McDaniel. I'm president of the Central Labor Council in Nashville, which is the local AFL-CIO affiliate. We have had, we work sometimes in partnership with a worker center called Workers Dignity. We've had a great deal of wage theft, particularly in the hospitality industry. And so I'm really interested in the cooperative model around, we have businesses that go into business and in and out of business frequently in Nashville. And it's really creating, I think, an opportunity, but it has created cases of wage theft. So that's why I'm interested in cooperatives. I think it would be an excellent model in Nashville for us to try.
Hi, and I'm York Rieger. I'm a professor of theology at Vanderbilt. I direct this Wendell & Cook program that several of us are affiliated with. We're focusing on issues of economic and ecological justice. And what's probably unique about us, there's no other program at a theology school anywhere I know, is that we're doing these things with an eye towards labor and the agency of working people. So my interest really is, how, as we talk about economic justice, what is the contribution that working people themselves, all the way to the 99%, can be making here. And of course, unions is one trajectory, and I think co-ops is another one that's closely related, but not to be confused.
Hi, Bianca. Not to add another sort of, interest on you to try and speak to, but I did a lot of...
It's perfect. I'm taking notes. I
did a lot of organizing in New York City, primarily in homeless communities and around homeless rights. And for that population, the concerns are really sort of life and death. And I'm wondering if sort of how co-ops might be a sort of site of survival and things like that. So thank you so much.
Okay, I think that's everybody now. Thank you all for humoring me and giving me a little bit more information about you all. So just to give you a little bit about myself, I will say my trajectory into both church and cooperatives was really accidental. I grew up right outside New York City. My parents left New York City in the mid-'80s and moved out to New Jersey, 10 miles and a world away. And then really had a high priority on education and assimilation. And for me, their understanding of the world was very much like it's unfair and you just have to survive it, and to very much keep your head down. And I had a couple of experiences through high school and college that had me realize I had both a responsibility and I could change things in my community and in the world, but also had a responsibility to try to create the world that I wanted. And I feel very grateful for those experiences. By the time I was going to college, I wanted a school that had sort of community at the center, and I didn't really know what that meant. And ended up at a Jesuit school in Baltimore called Loyola. And again, really by accident. I had been out of church since I was about 13. Made a deal with my mother that if I got confirmed, I never had to go back. And and she agreed. I realized now as an adult, I had a lot of big theological questions. And there was no adult in my life that was equipped to have those conversations with me. And so the questions weren't seen as a positive thing. I yeah, so oftentimes I really say I'm grateful, like I was out of church during my formative years and got to come back. So in college, I studied abroad in El Salvador, where I both had some really mystical experiences and started to go back to church. But it was really because I was seeing that church, people felt like church had a really actual material impact in their daily life and their daily like survival or not. And I had never seen church exist like that for me or my family in the suburbs. You know, we like went and got communion and walked out the back in 42 minutes, and it, you know, it had no correlation to the rest of our home life, daily life world, really. And sort of was graduating, like, what do I do? What's next? And ended up wanted to do an AmeriCorps year or something, and ended up doing Lutheran Volunteer Corps in Washington, D.C. at Luther Place. And so I got on staff at Luther Place in 2011 and came off staff very recently because BCI has like grown sufficiently. So I will say for me, Luther Place was a whole new world. So I want to paint the picture of where Luther Place is and who it's been. So Luther Place, you know, 145, I think, year old Lutheran congregation, about 6 blocks north of the White House. Has a long history of social justice work. But for me, I always felt connected to the story of Luther Place in like the 50s and 60s. So when the riots happened, you know, there was 3 spots in DC where there were uprisings. One was 14th Street Northwest, one was 7th Street Northwest, and then 8th Street Northeast, which passes behind like Union Station, all sort of historic Black business districts. So Luther Place sits at the base of the 14th Street corridor. During the riots, Luther Place opened up their doors. 10,000 people came through for food, clothing, medical care. And so that was always so inspiring to me about like, what does it mean to say like we're in this place in this moment, and like, how do we respond? And I feel like that's the question for all of our communities right now. It's like, what's the resource inventory you have? Like what's the where you are and the tools you have and the people you have, and like, what is your call like right now? And I actually feel like those things always show up, and it's a matter of like whether we're like actually spiritually prepared to say yes, and whether we've done the work in our communities to be able to have a communal yes to like what's being asked of us. But I was lucky to work with a pastor who had just come from Baltimore as well, Pastor Karen Brow, and she really thought of like a parish model, even though we were a Lutheran church, and that's not like traditional thought process there of being like responsible for geography. And DC is gentrifying so fast that like the dominant narrative of where we were in DC is that it was too far gone in terms of gentrification. All the nonprofits were selling their buildings and moving east of the river. And so it was creating sort of a vacuum. And there were still pockets of like substantial pockets of low-income families who are now sort of not served or connected to a lot of institutions. Like Rosemary was saying, I had been organizing and doing community engagement, and that looked like a lot of different things, but always with the bias of like, the community will tell you what they want to do if you're actually listening and in relationship with people. I feel like oftentimes churches, nonprofits too, both, any sort of like nonprofit industrial complex, you'll like say we want to do this, or we get grant funding from somewhere outside of our community to do this, and then we try to force people towards that, or we do the thing without actually having buy-in, like, or we try to create buy-in once we already have the program. And so we had a bias of doing a lot of listening and then collective application to anything that we were doing. In 2016, after the election, like I was really distraught, and my old boss used to have a like, when in doubt, do a one-to-one. Like that was always her, like when you're in doubt, go relate to people, go talk to people, like go listen. And so started doing one-to-ones, and the things that came up, like people had immediate fears around deportation or detention, what would happen around financial and custodial power of attorney related to their kids. Were their kids sort of like prepped for what was happening? And once we started to deal with those things as much as we could in the immediate like emergency planning and stuff, the next level of questions people were asking were like, well, what about my job? I'm losing control over where I go. Wage theft was happening, more verbal abuse at work, more threatening to call ICE, more like managers taking money off the top of people's checks, like just like more egregious wage theft and abuse at work than I had previously heard of, but also like not a new phenomenon. There was just some emboldened actors by the 2016 election. So, you know, we had worked with another incubator. My colleague at my old job runs a similar program. So there's two of us, sort of church-based incubators, and they're Grace in Action in Detroit, Michigan. So I knew they had started a cleaning co-op, and I knew that there was cleaning co-ops across the country, and sort of Ignorance on Fire was like, let's see if people want to do this. You know, I know about a dozen people that work in commercial or residential house cleaning right now. Let's see what we can do. At this point, I'm still on staff at Luther Place and doing this sort of around my full paid work. And we pulled together about a dozen people, did some info sessions on what's a cooperative. Now, I will say our community had a little bit, the soil was a little bit fertile because there's a number of housing cooperatives in our community. And DC has the highest concentration of housing co-ops in the country. And so there's lots of people who are familiar with this idea of shared ownership when it relates to their housing. Way less familiarity when it comes to their job. But in our case, the only things that haven't been sold out from under people are things that are collectively owned. So like the low income buildings that are left are either public housing buildings, which are a version of shared ownership, or tenant owned housing cooperatives. So those are the only things that are low income, that have almost entirely the only things that are left. And so, and side note, you know, I like people to think about like how this relates to church, like how do co-op values relate to church, and how can we use actually the skills that we already have as church communities, but actually like shared ownership of property and like a staying power in a community over time is actually a thing we're already very familiar with. And that collective ownership means you're not like vulnerable to like the whims of like what's happening, or other people's financial interest about your community. Not that churches never get bought out, or not that certain churches wouldn't decide like this is actually financially best for our community to do something, but a lot of the old denominational churches have been sitting on, you know, you have a building for 145 years in a community, like that's staying power that almost nothing else has. The other thing I always talk to people is about like democracy. Like church community actually already gives us practice for like, we have to listen to people we don't like, or having to come to consensus. And those are skills that are really helpful in cooperatives, and sort of shared ownership or shared leadership. So we had about 8 people decide they wanted to do a cleaning co-op, that they were excited about the idea. And so we did training through we did training through 2018. Yeah, training through 2018. They became operational in 2019. And now, you know, we're in the midst of COVID and all of what that means. But COVID to me has also been a lot of opportunity. I think Vanda was saying this as well, around like cracks being exposed and more people being willing to acknowledge that those cracks exist is actually like opportunity if we decide to look at it that way. I just want to, so at first, you know, there was a lot, like a ton of overlap with Luther Place, and how we did a lot of explaining to Luther Place, like who we are and the incubation project and what we were going to do. So I want to just, if I'm allowed to share my screen, where is it? So we did lots of presentations, but this is a little graphic that I think is helpful. So, and this is, we would present to the congregation pretty regularly. And then we really started doing a lot of education on labor and like the labor sort of stories about labor in the Bible. But so Luther Place as a congregation provided space, talent, like, so there's lots of volunteers from Luther Place at first. For me, this doesn't entirely accurately describe, like, what do I mean for catalyst for the project? We had a 145-year history to name that, like, we have a long history of creating sustainable institutions. I didn't say this before, but Luther Place also started N Street Village, which is the largest service provider for women experiencing homelessness in the district, and Lutheran Volunteer Corps. So a long history of like supporting and creating sustainable institutions. So that was one way of that. Luther Place served as our fiscal sponsor for a year and a half. So we were able to apply for grant funding and things like that immediately. I'll talk about the incubator. So we decided a 501c3 was the best for a couple of reasons, but one was like insulating the congregation from financial risk. And there's, you know, there everywhere that there's a arrow between two institutions, there's lots of MOUs and contracts and understanding and conversation. But the incubator has financial autonomy and did training, technical assistance, and back-end admin services for cooperatives that were in formation. And we talked about a benefit being community outreach and soft relationship building for Luther Place. So people being more open to the idea of partnering with Luther Place. And a lot of our young adults, I will say, come through because they know Luther Place is doing other things. So Luther Place has been one of the main support hubs for the current BLM protests in DC. Like, people look to see, like, is there any action behind your community's values? And so I would say, you know, soft relationship building. And in some communities, being affiliated with the church is better or worse. So when we were working with the school, that was harder. We did a summer camp for about 5 years for local elementary school. But when we were talking to parents that were people of faith themselves, primarily Catholic, but not exclusively, me being affiliated with the church was a strong positive. So I just let people be where they are, like, in that regard, and figure it out. And never making any participation in anything sort of a requirement for participating in something else. So never making it be that someone had to, sometimes we'd ask people to come present about their project, but other than that, no requirement of like coming to church or being a part of the church or being a member or any of those things to participate in any of the other community-based programs. And then the cooperative. So in our case, also, this was clearly my presentation to Luther Place folks, but making it clear, like, increasing worship attendance would be a welcome consequence, but not an intended benefit. So being really explicit about what benefits could come to a community of faith, but not over-promising at all. And then we have the cooperatives. So we were primarily working with undocumented folks. So we were doing LLCs, so there's a legal way of business ownership for folks who are mixed immigration status. But honestly, we'll probably stick with LLCs for most of our projects. We now support, in some capacity, almost 10 co-ops, and almost all of them are incorporated as LLCs because the co-op statute in DC, there's not enough benefit to incorporating as a cooperative. So we provide a lot of things subsidized, like bookkeeping and legal support, and over time and as a co-op gets training, they start to take on more of the financial responsibility, and we sort of decrease our financial investment over time. So I want to really quick, I'm not totally clear about my time. There's a couple more things I want to say about cooperatives really broadly, but I know I just threw a lot of information at you all. So I want to pause and see if there's like questions, did anything get sparked? And we'll sort of go from there.
This may be in your situation not a big problem because this is an active church, but did you find any pushback or questions or people doubtful about the project?
Definitely. You know, some like, I would say Luther Place had less resistance to like, how is this church or how does this count than most communities, I think. But the primary resistance was around liability, like who's responsible if something fails? Is the church insulated from risk? Is the church's 501c3 at risk? So if you're doing food distribution, you know, nobody, you know, but once you start getting into the economy or creating alternative economy or creating alternative structures, there's more scrutiny on that because it's not a traditional church activity. But I would say Luther Place did pretty fine. Again, we did a lot of teaching around how the institutions would relate to each other, what they could expect of one another, and then really utilize the talent and resources that were within the community. So we created a support team. So there's a board of the nonprofit, and then at Luther Place for 2 years, there was a support team of volunteers who really saw it as their like sort of investment was to support the co-op and the co-op members. So sometimes that looked like just having meals with them. Sometimes that looked like doing some research, like when the co-op was looking at insurance policies for themselves, like the support team took on some of that research. And that's really the model that we're looking to replicate, is not all of the co-ops will be supported by Luther Place, but to having a community-based institution and or a community of faith that is connected to any of the small businesses or co-ops that we support. So that could be the Logan Circle Community Association could decide to take on a co-op, but we have New Synagogue Project, which is a Jewish congregation in the city that's taken on one of the co-ops as like they support them and fundraise for them and things like that. So, but we did a lot of conversations about like why dealing with power and dealing with the economy and dealing with money was related to our faith, because there is a small contingency of like churches for Sunday morning, but I think the groundwork that got laid by having a parish model, like the idea that we're responsible to a given geography, was important. That helped sort of combat that. Because it meant we cared about everything flowed from that. We had a community organizer whose job it was to relate to people in the community and not for going to church. It was to get clear on their worries and concerns. And so if you're responsible for a given, like I had a pastor in Minneapolis, started a bunch of small businesses from the church Redeemer in Minneapolis, talked about like, they're in the neighborhood of Harrison. He was like, I'm Harrison's pastor, whether or not they ever set foot into the church. And so like that creates like a different worldview and different questions. So I feel like that's some of what helped combat that.
Thanks. This is really fascinating. I mean, it sounds like you have the perfect community for doing that. Just quickly to follow up, did you write some of this up or somebody else write on it or publish on it? Because I think we're really in the same boat. We're doing some of the same things, facing some of the same struggles. So maybe you have some of this already out there and then we wouldn't have to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah, I don't have as much time to write as I would like. I'm a worker owner. I own my own business. And then I run or help run our Ward 2 mutual aid work, which does meals and relationship building across a couple hundred families in the ward. I don't have as much time to write as I would like, but I really would like to, because I think no one teaches you how to do this stuff. And it would be nice to, so I would say the beauty of co-ops, sort of like some things about co-ops is like cooperation amongst co-ops is a sort of value of alternative economics. So we were able to call Center for Family Life in New York, which is now franchising cleaning co-ops, and be like, can we have your training manual? We called Grace in Action in Detroit and said, like, can we have your stuff? We called Wages, which was formerly Prospera, or which was the other way? One of them was formerly the other in California, and they shared resources with us. So in that way, there is some resources, but I would like to be writing about what we're doing. That's a goal for 2020.
Great, thanks.
I really want to fast move into what BCI is doing since COVID, because we again, so COVID happened and realized like this is going to be. I knew very early it would be a long haul. Like this was not something that was going to end quickly. And so we decided to shift from starting new cooperatives. We were looking into stormwater management because we were looking for if co-ops, like for me, co-ops are two things. Co-ops respond to market failure. So like why rural electric co-ops are so like successful or popular is because it was never profitable enough for regular electric companies to do co-ops in rural areas or do electric service to rural areas. So co-ops came in to fill that gap. So there's story after story after story of co-ops emerging when there's market failure. I will say in the history of Black co-ops, which were originally mutual aid societies, it was not just market failure, it was like structural racism and oppression and like legal exclusion from the economy on top of market failure that we saw a lot of Black co-ops form. So I have a bias that like when there's market failure, there's opportunity for co-ops. So that's sort of one. We decided, and we were nervous about who wants to start a new business in the middle of like a pandemic and recession and sort of uncertain times around the economy. So we shifted from, and then second is co-ops are really great for folks who, Ellen talked about this a little bit too, a couple people around people who are like, for whatever reason, not, are like excluded from sort of traditional employment. So whether that's somebody was formerly incarcerated, whether that's somebody who's undocumented, like whatever ways people are excluded from the traditional economy, co-ops like can have a place there. I've seen a bunch of social enterprise stuff that sounds more like Ellen's, where there's a small business, like I think Homeboy Industries is a great example of this. Homeboy Industries that creates sort of social enterprise businesses that create sustainable, good employment for people, also serves as job training. I've been hearing some rumblings of people looking to then take those businesses and convert them into worker-owned businesses. So like once the business is stable, the business gets supported by the nonprofit until the business is stable, can pay their folks living wages, people are trained, know the day-to-day operations, and then convert into worker-owned cooperatives. So like almost like spin-off businesses. So I've been hearing some rumblings of that.
Can I ask a quick question about that, Bianca?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
When you talk about your cooperative in the slide that you showed about the symbiotic kind of relationship and the clear understanding between the incubator you created with the support of the church and then the LLCs that the incubator then creates, like, what kind of timelines do you have on that is one of my questions. And then my second question, and I don't mean to hijack the discussion, is when you talk about some of the cooperatives that you're starting, do you already start with a skill set, or what is your training like? Because I would just be very interested to know if you already start with a group of people that already have, I know you mentioned the year-long training for house cleaning, but I'm just interested in the timelines on that, because I guess I'm looking at this from a nonprofit perspective. So you do approach a church for sort of this initial discussion just where we are, it seems like a lot of church have grant applications and outreach applications, but to go deeper than that, you know, just to start to create the conversation around what that actually looks like. Because it is, I think, in my experience, a different mentality from some of the suburban churches that we do work with.
Yeah.
I'm sorry if I hijacked. If you
No, that's perfect. So I will say when there's a challenge, so the beauty of co-ops is like this collective ownership, like our folks average house cleaning almost $30 an hour. Like that's unheard of in house cleaning, right? But there's some downsides. You're taking some folks who are the most marginalized and most accustomed to not being in ownership of things and saying like, now here's your own business, which is things that fail regularly all the time. So there's hard skills and soft skills training that we do. And we're looking to actually start developing a network of cleaning co-ops. So Dulce Hogar is the, like Sweet Home in Spanish, is the cleaning co-op that's in DC. We're looking to start an affiliate cleaning co-op in Northern Virginia and eventually do Maryland as well, and create a network of cleaning co-ops in the area. And some stuff I've learned, the cleaning co-op, the members need nothing to do with the website, the logo, like how you incorporate. You don't really, like business owners that start with wealthy business owners, they just pay people to do those things. And then they give an opinion and then they go away, right? Your brain space doesn't have to get occupied by those things. What we want people's brain space occupied with is team dynamics. So like team building amongst decision makers. How are you going to make decisions? Whatever hard skills come with your business, and like really their own like leadership development is, and whatever hard skills on top of like cleaning, but then like financial literacy, like do they understand the health of their business? So we first started with a group of people and said like, hey, you're already doing cleaning, do you want to do cleaning? And we didn't get a feasibility study till way late. We were already in, we'd already decided we were doing it. Whatever the number said, we were doing it. I would not do that now. Now I think we or it's a mix. So we were getting ready to, we were getting feasibility studies commissioned on stormwater management. So thinking rain gardens, permeable concrete, roof gardens, things, rain barrel installation, things that require maintenance, but low education, and could provide living wage work. So we were going to get that and a distributed childcare. So thinking in-home childcare, like pods of childcare, as opposed to a childcare center, which will become even more important in COVID. The idea behind getting those feasibility studies and the numbers is we don't want to do that. I don't want to pull people in and start training them, and then we get the numbers and the business won't work. But in COVID, what we've been doing is relating to people who have either started cooperatives or have cooperative projects that they have information already that they've been doing without any support. We've listened to all of them, and we have a convening of all the co-ops in the DMV at the end of the month. The first things that come up are legal, training, and bookkeeping are like the thorns in their sides. So we're creating a network that will provide some of those or all of those subsidized or low cost. The co-ops get to relate to each other. And then sort of the third phase is looking into having benefits like healthcare or other group purchasing that the co-ops can do because they're networked. Most places co-ops aren't networked. They're networked more by sector than by like just being networked with the other co-ops in their area. So that's what we've been doing in COVID. So I think, you know, for me, I'm like, man, I want to get numbers on a translating co-op. That's what I want to do right now. So we're all on Zoom, and all of a sudden every meeting needs translation, and it can be done from anywhere. So I think there's some opportunities. At this point now, I think it's a little bit of a mix. My organizing, like purity around the organizing would say you talk to people and see what they want to do. Sort of purity from the business side would be like, you don't do anything without a feasibility study. Trying to do something in the middle. Megan in Detroit, I'll just give this talked with me about deciding what kind of projects was your incubator or sort of like nonprofit going to look to produce. They could produce co-ops that would do high wage work outside of your community, thinking like home cleaning or dog walking or things like that. You could do like deeply needed services in your community that could break even, or deeply needed services in your community that weren't going to break even for a wild amount of time and will probably need substantial grant funding. My colleague Megan in Detroit, they have a mesh network internet installation project. That's one of those things that will, because 40% of Detroiters don't have high-speed internet, that's something that like will be grant funded for almost 10 years before it will make enough money to sustain itself. But a deeply needed project in their community worth doing. They do screen printing. That's one that is mostly young people. It's a mix of people in the community buy, people not in the community buy. The money stays in the community. Their house cleaning project, you go outside of the community and do high wage work, and like, you know, so it really depends. That's other ways to think about it. If you're looking for projects that would meet a deep need in your community, then it's listening to people in the community and then running the numbers on those things. If you're looking to provide high wage work and it doesn't matter kind of who it benefits, you can get the numbers on what businesses would be really profitable and find people willing to do that work. So that's the mix, I would say. And timeline. We did the cleaning co-op for a year. I would say like 6 to 12 months is probably 6 to 12 months, but with all the other things like legal and design sort of organized and happening outside of the folks getting trained. That's what I would say. Yeah.
Thanks for this, Bianca. I just want to note our time, and then also that we've got Francisco here. So if there's any other questions, maybe we can kind of go. I know this feels so fast.
I'm so sorry.
Well, this has been so wonderful. I'm sorry that we don't have more time. So Francisco, please go for it.
Your audio is,
Yeah.
There we go.
Okay, so thank you so much. Yeah, so much to take in, and it's great. So I have a ton of questions, but one thing I wanted to ask is, how much of this work was done in the context of Sunday morning, and what did it look like outside of Sunday morning? Like as the work related to the parish or the members of the church itself.
Mm-hmm. So I will say, again, Luther Place is distinct in that it's used to spinning off. Like it had this history of creating institutions that were closely related for a long time and then spinning them off. So we got to sort of like walk in the history of that. At first we did Sunday morning for like everything. There was a blessing of the workers. There was listening sessions. We pulled people on Sunday Adult Ed Hour to ask if the worker owners could ask them questions about services and pricing. When, like I said, we did a month of sort of what, like co-op education, but then relating it to faith. We did a lot on Sundays, like between 2017, 2018, 2019, really laying the groundwork. Because we wanted, this is honest, we wanted a base of the church to use the cleaning service, right? So we wanted them to feel invested in it and pass it on to their friends. But really, like, to decide, like, poverty isn't okay in our community in the way that it exists, and instead of a food pantry, we're going to start businesses, is a leap for a lot of communities, even communities as far left as Luther Place or as like sort of with that history. So we did a lot of work on Sunday mornings. We do less work on Sunday mornings now. Oh, also initially in our like agreements, the MOU between the nonprofit and Luther Place, there was like lots of reporting agreements. Like I gave a monthly report to council. I wrote in our annual report. This was really like initially was Luther Place's project. Now it's sort of hit the phase where we have a space use agreement. We're still there. We could use space for meetings pre-COVID. And Luther Place will be invited to create a support team for the next co-op that gets started. And if not, then like we'll bounce to whatever the other community that we'll work with is. So it has shifted over the 4 years that we've been working on this project, but could not have gotten started without the church community at first at all.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. You have handled so much so quickly. Thanks for that. And we just, it looks like we've been joined by Nathan, so want to sort of welcome him. And so again, thank you so much, Bianca.
Yeah, and I would say one thing, if any, like sort of, if there's any things that would be particularly helpful documentation wise, like feel free to, like, Rosemary has my email to reach out. So like the frequently asked questions that we like gave the congregation, or like specific documentation that might be helpful, or how we like fundraise for any of the projects, or contacts like for feasibility studies or for training, financial literacy training, what's a co-op, any of those things, feel free to reach out, especially for those who are thinking about it or doing the work on the ground. And I'll just throw my email in the chat before I go. And I know like Ellen wanted to talk like nonprofit numbers, so we can make a plan. Okay, thank you all.
Thank you so much, Bianca. That was great. Thank you.
So friends, we've got a few minutes. Nathan is here. I want to just give us a brief moment. Nathan, we're going to set to begin with you in about 3 minutes. Is that?
Oh, yeah, that's fine. Whatever works for you.
Great. So friends, if you need to go and refresh yourself, and we'll start here and very shortly, and I'll give Nathan a short introduction. It'd be great. All right.
Yeah. Thanks again, Bianca.
Thank you, Bianca. That was just really exciting. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Yeah, it's a weird time, but also like a lot of opportunity. Thank you all.
Yeah. I like wrote down like so many quotes, but yeah, you were just great. Thank you very much.
Yeah. And I don't know that I like sufficiently answered your question.
No, you
like musings about.
No, the one thing that I remember that you said that I tried to write it down verbatim, but it's basically like the things that haven't been sold out from under people were those that were collectively owned. And that was just like, yeah, that is life and death issue right there. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. All right, Rosemary,
Okay.
it was nice
Thanks
to chat.
so much. Yeah,
Okay.
Great work. I loved hearing it, and we'll be in touch. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, bye.
Over there in Boulder.
No, it's middle of the morning. It's good.
Yeah, good to see you. Thanks for joining us, Nathan.
You too. And Rosemary, I was looking through notes and I think I'm just like, should I do slides and should I do a presentation, or is it more informal than that?
Oh, whatever you'd like. Yeah, if you want to show some slides, we have 30 minutes for you to talk about your project, and we've read truly much can be done, and So yeah, however you want to do it, we're open to that.
Okay, great. I think I'll just do the slides that I think you've seen, unfortunately. I was realizing you were at the AAR talk when I spoke on that paper. So I looked through the different versions of the talks that I have on that, and those ones seem the most fresh. So
No, that sounds good.
So I'll take you back a couple of years, but
that's good.
But there's more things have changed since then too. So
Thanks for joining us, Nathan. It is good to see you.
Good to see you. Good to
Looking
see you.
forward to it.
Yeah. And thank you also for the writing invitation. It's I was going to do a paper on some of these issues and ended up feeling like there wasn't enough there yet. But the opportunity to do a kind of shorter piece on the subject and in the context with Jessica and others, to me feels like, I feel like there's enough material for that, and it will help kind of hopefully, start some of these conversations about what this tradition can mean today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks so much for agreeing to work with us. For everybody else, just briefly, the Wendell & Cook program has these monthly series we're now calling interventions, based on our what we used to call the blog. And this is in October. We'll have a series on co-ops and religion, and Nathan, of course, will write a piece, and I'll be. There are several others who are working with us, so we'll advertise that when it's out. So thanks.
Great. Wonderful. Yeah. Sorry, I actually was just going to pull up the link to interventions and send it out to you all. Good. Well, I think we're all back. So thank you for keeping things timely. Yeah, so as we've talked a little bit about truly much can be done and everything for everyone a little bit this morning, and we're happy to have Nathan Schneider here with us this morning for the second half. So he is originally a journalist who writes about religion, technology, and democracy, but he's currently an assistant professor at media studies at University of Colorado Boulder. He's written a number of books, everything for everyone. Two other books here, God and Proof, the story of the search for the ancients to the internet, and then Thank You, Anarchy, notes from the Occupy Apocalypse. So he's got a wealth of knowledge here on issues that we're considering, democracy, worker cooperatives, cooperativism, and religion and church. So we're really happy to have him here, and I'll turn it over to him.
Great,
actually,
thank you.
Nathan, I'm so sorry. It might be helpful, it occurs to me, if we did what we did before Bianca, to have everybody go on around and introduce themselves. So could we do that quickly? Is that okay? Great.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So yeah, popcorn style again, please. I guess I can start off. I'm Aaron Stauffer, the Senior Research Fellow at Wendell & Cook. Just finished my PhD at Union Theological Seminary in social ethics, and working on this grant with Rosemary and Benny at the Southeast Center.
Stephen Handy, I pastor a church in downtown Nashville called McKendree United Methodist Church. And we are a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-class congregation, one of only one, I think, in the whole state of Tennessee for the Methodist Church, which is a sad commentary, but we won't go there today. We're intrigued and interested in what does it mean to be a church that is engaged in the work of shifting from the capitalistic perspective to some alternatives. So we're looking at co-ops as alternatives.
Hi, I'm George Schmidt, and I'm a current PhD student at Vanderbilt under the watchful, loving, mothering gaze of Professor Rieger. And I don't know if you know this, but a number of years ago, I was presenting at Drew Seminary's Trans Theological Colloquium, on how to break into vacant property and then how to set up squatting and like homesteading there. And I was so excited for this, and it was going to be so great. And there's really good practical, and like 5 people showed up. And I was like, why did just 5 people show up? And there was this guy, Nathan Schneider, down the hall that was giving some presentation. And I swore off ever reading anything by Nathan Schneider. But I was in DC.
Sounds like an amazing talk. I'm sorry I missed it.
Yeah, I was having some gin, and I was reading the book on Occupy, and the beginning journalistic detailing of Occupy like took me back there, and really like it was beautiful, and it was a romantic telling that made me feel like I was in that space again. So thank you. I don't have a question or anything. I don't know what to do.
I'm Vonda McDaniel. I'm president of the local Central Labor Council, which is the local AFL-CIO affiliate, and also part of the program committee for Winland Cook.
Wonderful to meet you.
I'm Ellen Peterson. I'm an executive director of a local nonprofit in town called Justice Industries, and we create small businesses to employ people specifically experiencing barriers to income, such as incarceration, homelessness, mental illness, coming out of domestic abuse. We have a couple of businesses called, one's a curbside glass recycling program. When Bianca mentioned earlier that that's where capitalism has failed, that's definitely one. You know, there's no money making in that. And then we have a mobile car wash that we just launched this summer. So that's what we do.
Right. Yeah. And global capitalism. It's such a like interesting, globally interconnected market, the recycling world.
Well, Nathan, my name is Benny Overton with Rosemary. I'm co-director of the Southeast Center. I was formerly, well up until last week, as a matter of fact, president of the local UAW here in Nashville. So I'm very interested in worker co-ops. That's our focus initially. But after reading your book, I'm much more open to the various forms of co-ops. So it's nice meeting you.
Very good to meet you too. Yeah, they can work together.
Oh yeah, most definitely.
Hi, Nathan. I'm Francisco Garcia, and I'm a PhD student at Vandy in theology. Also work with Jorg in the Winland Cook program. And I'm also an Episcopal priest and former labor organizer. So I'm just interested in all of it, all the intersections of co-ops as it relates to faith, organizing, and obviously challenging economic injustice. So I really appreciate your piece on Laudato Si, Pope Francis, and sort of like the recovering the Catholic social teaching around cooperatives.
Okay, I think that's everyone. So thank you, Nathan, for allowing us to do that. And now you've got the floor.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. It's an honor to be able to meet with you and to learn from you. And since you've read the essay, the chapter already, I'll try to be as brief as I can. Just kind of offer some extra commentary, trying to connect some of these ideas to where they might be useful to you. I also want to acknowledge today is the beginning of the scholars strike called for by my longtime friend Anthea Butler, and I'm participating in that. At the hour we're supposed to have our religion seminar, and instead our group is participating in the strike and engaging in counter activities, including this one. And later today in my class, I am holding class, but we disrupted the syllabus and are doing a kind of teach-in instead of the normal planned activities. So so glad to be participating in that strike with you. I'm going to share some slides here. Again, these are slides that originated for for American Academy of Religion presentation a few years ago that some of you attended. But you know, again, I'll emphasize the stuff that has changed. You know, again and again, I keep thinking of that idea of formation as central to this. That this European, or not European, Australian socialist politician approached me about while I was, you know, after I'd given a talk in Melbourne, and you know, said, one word for you, Nathan, that you need to understand: formation. And he had spent his retirement, despite having no religious affiliation, studying theology in order to understand where the Mondragon cooperative network in the Basque region came from. And after he'd written his major book on the topic, he really realized that he'd missed something, which is the centrality of formation as a spiritual and political and social and economic concept. The idea that through the economy we form our souls, and through the formation of our souls we can shape the economy. And this is a kind of concept that I, you know, as soon as I heard him say it, I knew what he meant, because, you know, I'm a Roman Catholic and had heard this term as a kind of bit of church jargon, but he, you know, landed on this recognition that this is really the generative concept that made Mondragon come into being. You know, this idea from 20th century, you know, Catholic social teaching and kind of Catholic practice helped produce not only this kind of interesting spiritual experiment, but this sense in which the spiritual practice became entrepreneurially, economically generative. And that's something that I think is so important about this story I'm going to tell. Often we think of religion as kind of superfluous to the economic, that it's like it helps us be a bit nicer in the economic sphere, or it helps us even challenge some of the rules of the economic sphere. And what I'm going to, you know, point out today is some of the ways in which in this particular legacy of Catholic cooperativism, religious activity and organization has actually introduced novel and unique entrepreneurial interventions that have enabled people to do things economically that haven't been possible otherwise, or haven't seemed to be as available otherwise. And you know, many of these examples are things that people have tried to do outside of this religious context and have not been able to do. So it's a, you know, it's a reminder of the power of our religious and spiritual commitments and concepts and communities, and what they can achieve in terms of bringing about alternatives. And you know, the person he's really referring to again is Father Jose Arizmendi Arrieta, a Basque priest who founded the Mondragon Worker Cooperative Network, which now employs about 80,000 people in the Basque region under Franco's fascist regime. And the author, you know, the person I'm referring to is Race Matthews, the author of this book, Jobs of Our Own, which I really recommend for anybody interested in exploring this stuff more. But this figure, Arizmendi for short, really reflects the way in which you know, the spiritual and the economic can be so intertwined. This, of course, goes back in the Christian tradition a long way. You know, we see in Book of Acts 2 and 4 this notion of holding all things in common. It's at first this kind of pure communism, and then very quickly they start to institutionalize a little bit. It becomes very, you know, almost funny to read for somebody experiencing cooperatives, where, you know, the horizontal structure breaks down and they start having to elect a board. You know, for anybody who's like set up a cooperative business or been in the early stages of it, it's just so familiar. And so like non-ethereal and spiritual, but just like, oh yeah, you know, I've seen that before. It's very familiar stuff. And in Catholic culture, developed further in the monastic period, after and during the kind of establishment of Christianity as the religion of the Roman Empire. These monastic communities form, and people set off into their own spaces, building their own economies in order to, in kind of contrast to the imperial religion of the times. And always there's this kind of bounce back and forth between that kind of early collectivist notion of what the Christian community should be and the imperialist notion, as we all, I think, know in our experience on some level. And in this tradition, in this back and forth, there are so many little gems. And in the article you read this too, but I just love this passage from the Rule of St. Clare, who was the friend of St. Francis. When writing the rule for women, she insisted on including, over the objections or over the against what the Pope had suggested. The Pope insisted that these women have a say in the running of their community. And that I just think this is such a beautiful idea, that the Lord reveals what is best to the lesser among us. So what better argument could you have for democracy, right? That the truth should come from often comes from the bottom. We also have this concept of the universal destination of goods, that all things ultimately are common to all people. And this idea comes into play in the kind of originary moment of modern Catholic social teaching, the 1891 encyclical Leo XIII, Rerum Novarum, which is really an attempt to deal with those vital, violent challenges of conflicts of labor and capital. And his response to it is that, rather than the dictatorship of the proletariat or the dictatorship of the robber barons, what we need to do is really rethink ownership and redistribute ownership and control and power across the economy. He didn't have a mechanism for how to do that, but he set Catholic social teaching at that period on a course for trying to figure out what this could mean, what it could mean to have this kind of shared distributed ownership. And by that time, of course, the kind of modern cooperative tradition had already started to take hold across Europe. Of course, this is not a European invention. Many of these ideas are things that indigenous and a variety of communities around the world have been practicing for many thousands of years, but they're kind of formalized in this particular matter in the 1840s in England, as well as kind of at the same time elsewhere in other countries. But this cooperative movement, this idea of business owned and governed by the people it serves, was a particularly good fit for the kinds of things that Pope Leo was talking about, to the point where it takes on this character even of, as this anonymous commentator in a 1944 America Magazine article describes as social worship, that the cooperative could enable this kind of business that integrates the economic and the spiritual through this sense of member control, this commitment to member education and empowerment, to a sense that business is actually a way of forming the human person. And this call from Pope Leo produces a huge range of experiments. In Italy, in the late 19th, early 20th century, Catholics start joining the far left communists actually in developing a large number of cooperative experiments and businesses, and developing one of the most sophisticated cooperative networks in the world. In early 20th century, late 19th in Quebec, we see the development of the North American credit union model, very much encouraged by church authorities at that time. When you read a 1950s biography of the founder, Alphonse Desjardins, every time he runs into a problem, some church figure or church community steps in and kind of says, keep going, we'll raise the money, keep at it. And it's all because they were trying to figure out how to answer Pope Leo's call. So this idea of a cooperative bank develops in that Catholic community attached to parishes in Quebec, and then gets imported into the United States, particularly through the work of Edward Filene, who brings Desjardins from Quebec down to the United States. And of course, Mondragon emerges out of this context. Also in Canada, in the maritime provinces, we see a range of cooperative experiments. And it's just become, this is a beautiful book, All Things Common, about worker-owned factories that emerge in Europe after World War II. A major American magazine, Catholic culture in the 50s and 60s, Jubilee, just a wonderful magazine, was owned by its subscribers. So this just idea that cooperative business, fits with this model is critical. And you have figures like John Ryan, who helped architect and inform the New Deal, pointing to this model. He was an economist at American University in Washington, D.C. And then you have people like Albert McKnight, who was founder of a lot of the architecture for the Southern farming cooperative movement in the 60s and 70s, did a lot of important fundraising, a Catholic priest and Pan-Africanist, who brought a lot to this, to the Black cooperative movement in the United States, and I think is somebody who we still have a lot more to learn from as a figure in American Catholic social teaching. And meanwhile, kind of quietly, even unknown to many Catholics, you have the Catholic Campaign for Human Development still very actively supporting the development of worker cooperatives, such as this case Opportunity Threads in North Carolina, which is now producing PPE, masks. I really recommend ordering some. That's what my family's been using. And then you have cases like Axia Home Loans, which is a company founded by a conservative Catholic businessman who just landed on this idea that he wanted his employees to own the business. Not at all from this kind of radical left tradition, but still just being a student of Catholic tradition, just seeing this kind of model as obvious. You read some of the ways in which Pope Francis has articulated these values in relation to ecology, in relation to technology, and it kind of leaves us at a moment still where I feel, as a Catholic personally, kind of frustrated. I have studied this history of the way in which some of the most powerful cooperative movements in modern economic history, the Mondragon in the Basque Country, the development of the North American credit union system, were so much energized by these models, by the Catholic, by Christian religious commitment that was determined to find another way. At the same time, today, what you often see, such as in this recent Vatican hackathon, is you tend to see Catholics and religious communities just copying things from the outside world into their context. And I'm not sure I'm seeing yet that kind of that particular kind of unique character of bringing the religious dimension, the religious commitments into those mainstream practices. It seems like they're playing catch up, and maybe it's a longer game, and there's more to come. But I don't see that imagination at play yet right now. I can't claim that there are all these projects or all these ways in which this rich tradition of Catholic social teaching is leading the way in building the next economy, and that saddens me. And I want to go back to this, this fellow Father Albert McKnight, because he makes a call that I think is really, really powerful, especially for where we find ourselves today. And this is he's writing I'm not sure exactly when he wrote this. It's compiled in a self-published kind of autobiography / collection of writings that's available online only now. And he, in it, he says, we have to reinvent the cooperative idea. And he frames this really in the context of racial inequality and the racial wealth gap, and says, this cooperative model is great. It's done so much with it, but isn't getting at the core problems of distribution in our societies. And we need to wake up to that. The cooperative principles, were developed in certain times and places, and they're not meeting the challenge of our moment today. For example, I've seen a lot of, among a lot of the younger cooperatives that I've worked with, they see themselves as trying to be intentionally anti-oppressive. They see themselves as trying to intentionally counteract some of the deep-seated, racial injustice and racism that we see in our society more broadly. And once I mentioned this to one of the board members of the International Cooperative Alliance, who's developed the guidance notes on what the cooperative principles mean, and I said, that first cooperative principle of open membership, isn't really interpreted in the same way among a lot of people that I know. That they interpret open as anti-oppressive, not just open door. And he said, well, that's not what it means. I think there's a long way to go in recognizing what is it that the cooperative principles and tradition actually do have to offer in the context of our moment today. How do we need to reinvent this idea, for instance, to meet the needs, the challenges of things like reparations and addressing the profound economic inequality that's among us today. If all we do is adopt the Rochdale principles of the 1840s, we might just be passing around the crumbs of a profoundly broken economy. And so I just want to end on that call from Father McKnight to allow ourselves to reinvent the cooperative idea for the challenges that we face today. All right, so I'll leave it there, and wherever you all want to take it, I would love to follow your lead.
Great, thank you so much, Nathan. This is really interesting. Friends, I just want to make sure that we're just, because we've got limited time, we've got about another 15 minutes for a conversation. If a question occurs to you and you want to kind of get in line for to ask it, type in stack into the chat, and that'll kind of put you in line, just so that we're clear. Or you could just simply type, I have a question. That's fine. One of the things, Nathan, I thought this was really, really important, particularly interesting, is looking for the unique contribution in the sort of economic models that religion provides or can provide, certain forms of religion, because not all religion is the same. I am interested, or not all, I guess, expressions of religion is the same. I'm not sure, perhaps, for one example of people using religion in a way that is different than the cooperative model that you've been talking about is, I'm not sure if you saw this article in the New York Times recently about a couple of individuals who are developing religious practices in order to help workers sort of deal with the Zoom fatigue and things like this. I think Casper Kyle and Angie Thurston, a couple of people from Harvard Divinity are developing this. That seems to me to be that's a different use of religion here. And then it seems that what you're looking for. So I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about that. I've got my own ideas and understandings about what it might look like and how to talk about that. But I'm just going to share the story in the group so that people can read it if they want. It's a particularly provocative just understanding of how it is that religion relates to the economy. And I think one that is worthwhile for us reflecting on if we're going to be developing resources for churches. So I'm curious to hear you say more about what it is you're looking for, and if you can provide examples that concretize that a little bit more. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, it was interesting to see that article come up. You know, Casper and Angie are old friends of mine, but it's interesting to see the contrast there. That they're mainly kind of, at least they seem to be really aiming at the managerial class, and trying to kind of ease, operate in this role of kind of management consultants. And yeah, that's not what I'm talking about. None of the cases I'm describing here are that. These are grounded in the concept of the preferential option of the poor, for the poor, where solutions need to begin and should and can and must, begin among the people who are most in need. That isn't to say that you don't involve those who have resources. That's often what happened, in the development of the early credit unions. Often in these stories, it means bringing in people who are able to introduce resources into the context, but they come in as allies and as supporters. And when you look at some of these most powerful models, they were recognizing the latent value among the poor, the latent power. And that's what cooperatives are really all about. It's same way when my grandfather grew up on a farm with no electricity, and the electric companies always said at that time in the 30s, poor 20s, poor people don't want or need electricity, right? And once the federal government gave them the power to create their own electric companies, they did that, and they we're very happy to have electricity, especially, it really changed a lot of dynamics for them. And same with the credit union system was all about using social ties in poor communities to help people determine how to responsibly allocate loans, right? The rich bankers didn't know who was worth lending to. Your neighbors did know who was worth lending to. And so these models over and over draw on the latent power and value of the poor that the owning class doesn't know how to see. And in the case of things like what Angie and Casper are doing, I hope that they use their talents in that direction more than is being represented in that article, because I do think that these practices of ritual and so forth, can be incredibly powerful. We see that in the work, for instance, of Adrienne Marie Brown and Emergent Strategy, who's bringing ritual and spiritual practices into poor people's movements. And I would love to see more of that.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I saw Jorg's right up here. Part of what's important to me, I think, especially as we begin to develop resources on this, is to understand that as much as the economy is a terrain under siege from a number of different sources, so is religion. And it's important that we're clear about how it is and where it is we're drawing distinctions and what traditions we're drawing from, and to allow people to connect up to. So that, because I think that's, we make decisions that provide clarity about what it is that we're about, I guess, and that's particularly important, I think, for here. I see Jorg and then Stephen, so we'll go there.
Maybe mine is more a philosophical question, but I think it really has to do with the project that we're trying to do. Well, thanks again, Nathan. It's always good to hear you talk about these things. We go back actually almost to Occupy Wall Street. We met shortly thereafter, both of us working on books on the topic and learning from each other. So that was a good memory. But that's what I'm connecting to, right? So Occupy Wall Street in a way was a broad movement, talked about the 99%. This is not talking about liberals and conservatives. It's really talking about how we're all affected by it. And in your writings, I oftentimes see how you're really arguing. I mean, even in your presentation today, you said, there's a conservative businessman who's also been instrumental in doing this co-op work. So my question is, how can, or I mean, say a bit more about how you think this cooperative moment can actually help us move forward. It's not about a middle road or, mediating between, liberals and conservatives. In some ways, I would argue that the liberals have to be radicalized just as much as the conservatives, because they always want to help, but they're not really quite there yet when it comes to people's agency, when it comes, to sort of this bottom-up move that you're proposing. So just wondering what your thoughts are, as we're trying to engage religious communities. How do you spread that message to church communities, whether liberal or conservative, that are not quite there yet?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great point that there's progress that needs to be made from different cultural sides on these questions, and over, especially looking at the cooperative history, it has played on, all kind of sides of American cultural history, and today, a lot of the political power, there's a lot of political power in rural electrics and credit unions. So a lot of the cooperative political power is conservative right now. And for instance, President Trump signed, in 2018, the most important worker ownership legislation in decades, the Main Street Employee Ownership Act. Pence has had long-standing ties with the Indiana credit unions. So there are these opportunities to have this kind of like cross-cultural understanding. I think this moment is so critical. At the same time, I personally would love to see this movement be like a very explicitly anti-racist, like green, New Deal type of thing. And so we have to be very attentive to what kinds of compromises, what kinds of lines we want to walk in order to do this. This moment is so essential. The New Deal was the moment where a lot of the enabling legislation for the US cooperative movement happened, and where we demonstrated that you can do cooperatives at scale with major policy support, and that it becomes a money-making enterprise for the federal government. I've been trying to imagine, since we're entering that kind of moment all over again, what kind of agenda we need to have going forward. So I've just posted in the chat a short overview of the kinds of, a kind of sketch of how I've been thinking about what, a kind of a truly ambitious policy framework for what it would take to bring cooperative and, solidarity economy into the mainstream of the economy in very serious ways. And that means, a new financing regime that knows how to invest in communities. We've done it before in targeted areas, but if we're serious about this, we need to recognize that this system, the rules of the game, are written against community ownership, and they can be rewritten for community ownership. And if we're in a moment where the investors are going to be scared and they're going to hide and cling to their money, we need to be ready with solutions for what community ownership looks like in the middle of this crisis that we're going through. The political formations, I always go back and forth. I always want to hold as many opportunities open as possible, because we need to recognize this is something that crosses political lines, but I could see it being a progressive agenda item as it was in the New Deal. I could see it being, a cross-partisan thing as the 2018 Main Street Employee Ownership Act was, but we got to be ready for both.
Thanks.
Wonderful. I see Stephen up, and then George.
Nathan, thank you for creating a high level of curiosity with me. I believe we as followers of Jesus need to be more curious. So as I think about curiosity, how do I'm in a downtown church, we will talk life out of a subject. You call the church folk, right? We'll talk life out of it, not life into it. What would you suggest as a small experiment with a church in downtown Nashville? Because I can frame this in 15 minutes and my folk will say, let's go, Pastor, we're ready. But I don't have the tools and the technology, only the tools right now to understand do we move into policy first? Do we move, I mean, where do we start? I'm trying to be practical for me, because I've got a congregation that we're social justice woke, and they're just looking for a way to say we're doing something other than reading another article, right? We want to be informed theologically, but we don't want to be overly informed that we don't have any earthly good. So help me here, please.
That's great. You know, here in Colorado, I have, you might be implying, you know, a truth, which is that I have a tendency to talk things to death. Here in Colorado, I co-founded a co-op study circle, you know, which is, you know, the kind of traditional way to get this kind of thing going. And so we had a bunch of people coming, you know, month after month. And then like after about 9-10 months, people just completely stopped attending, right? And then one of the members started up a investment club using a weird legal structure, allows regular people to put in small amounts of money and invest in small businesses. And then tons of people came in, and it was more diverse and more cross-class than the like free study circle. You know, people were ready to move, you know, ready to get their hands dirty. So, you know, actually that idea of an investment club, it's a legal structure that we have in this country that's, you know, it's kind of a weird structure, but it allows this to happen. We have documents that you know, we share across the country. There are several of these clubs. And so if people want to set one up, it's a really good way to start learning and helping, especially people who've never thought of themselves as investors, to begin, you know, thinking of themselves as economic agents in their community. And I can help connect you with folks interested in that. Another tool that I think is really important, you know, the one kind of cooperative structure that has scaled rapidly and dramatically in the United States without its own policy tools. So credit unions have their own policy structure, rural electrics have their own policy structure, farmer cooperatives have their own policy structure, but purchasing cooperatives don't. And these are very powerful. And these are organizations where you are pooling purchasing power. And you look at one like the Community Purchasing Alliance in DC, which is an alliance, you know, it's a co-op of churches and charter schools, community organizations, largely in communities of color, that are buying boring shit together, excuse my language, you know, like garbage contracts and copier contracts, you know what I'm talking about, you know, and they're saving boatloads of money because of this. And then they're also able to decide, well, who are we going to buy these services from? So they've built up Black-owned businesses. They've helped facilitate employee ownership conversions of their suppliers. And so, you know, there's been a lot of talk about anchor institutions, you know, trying to convince the big nonprofit universities and hospitals to change their purchasing practices, right? Why don't we just start our own anchor institutions that are themselves cooperatives, that have these cultures built in, and that are based on what we're already doing, which is buying garbage contracts, buying copier contracts, all the boring stuff, putting solar panels on the roof, and do it together. And then we can use that power to start to see what other kinds of projects we can do. Do those sound like reasonable? Do those sound feasible in your from where you're sitting?
I was just on a call 2 weeks ago with 8 people thinking about creating a real estate investment company.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah, this resonates with me at a high level. Thank you. I just ordered your book, by the way. It'll be here tomorrow.
What's that?
I just ordered your book.
Oh, cool.
It'll be here by Amazon tomorrow. Praise the Lord.
Thank you.
Well, great. So I see we've got George here. Nathan, I want to be aware of your time though too. Do you got time for one more question?
Yeah, I do actually. Because of the strike, I don't have the thing. I don't have a hard stop.
I was about to say I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but I guess that's but I just have sort of an inchoate thought. I don't know really where I'm going with this, but sort of you know, David Graeber recently passed, and thinking about anarchism and these sort of and Occupy, and thinking about Occupy almost as like it had a lot of direct action that it was involved in, but in other ways, it was sort of this demonstration of alternative community. And thinking of it almost in terms of like wildcat strikes, you know, there are like wildcat co-ops almost, like these things that don't have, you know, sort of thoughtful, intentional, long-term strategy planning, but just sort of like happen spontaneously as a sort of like means of survival or a means of like direct action. So I'm wondering, do you like the thoughts on just that idea or any other sort of models that you've seen, something like that? And thank you also for the talk and for being here too.
Well, thank you for breaking your rule and being part of it rather than continuing to boycott my my work out of spite.
I had my reservations, but I've
yeah. So you know that I you know also you know came up very much in that kind of anarchist activist tradition, but one of the things that really you know, that really struck me in doing, you know, for a long time, my work was all centered on resistance movements. And one of the things that I had to learn, you know, maybe should have been basic, but that I had to learn because you know, I'm part of a generation that's been all about the spontaneous, the fast. We can organize, we can get 10,000 people in the streets, you know, on Facebook in 20 minutes, you know. But what I had to learn was going back and, you know, for instance, talking to, you know, my mentors at the time, you know, while I was covering Occupy, I had these mentors who were civil rights elders, and I'd bounce ideas off them and they'd say, no, you don't, it's like, yeah, we were protesting in the streets, but we were also organizing cooperatives in Jackson too, you know. And we were also, you know, who do you think was going to the voting drives? It was the members of the farmer cooperatives who wouldn't get kicked off their land, you know, like, so they were emphasizing to me that these acts of resistance were built on the basis of a foundation of longer term alternative building work. And you see, you know, how Gandhi talked about the, you know, that 90% of his work was what he called the constructive program, and 10% was the shiny protest stuff you saw at the top. You know, constructive program being, you know, the community, the village cooperatives, that's why the spinning wheel is on the flag of India. So I've really come to feel that we, especially in my generation, we have come to celebrate too much. We've tended to focus exclusively on the visible, on the viral, on the spontaneous, without recognizing that all of that, which may be well and good, has to be built on the foundation and relies on legacies that we inherit. And so I've come to feel like attention is much more needed on those, building those infrastructures of resistance and of the future. And so a lot of these traditions, yeah, they're long and slow. I mean, but it took 10 years from when Arizmendi Arrieta in the Basque region started working on building a cooperative to when they first opened the business. He started a school in order to build a cooperative. Yeah, and it's that kind of slow work that I feel, at least my generation is in danger of neglecting, and that I've wanted to really emphasize and shine a light on. And on top of that, when you have that foundation, spontaneous activity becomes all the more powerful because it has a grounding. Whereas a lot of the protest and resistance work we've seen in recent years, you know, it's like you can turn out 100,000 people at a march in DC, but it doesn't mean the same as the March on Washington in the 60s because, you know, there's no foundation. And you know, the enemy knows that the day after you have nothing to work from, you know, all you had was an event. And so it's that longer term stuff that I feel most called to right now.
I don't know why I boycotted you for so long, Nathan. It's just, can't believe this.
Well, thank you so much. This is very rich, and you've given us a lot to think about. Again, yeah, you've stayed past time, so we don't want to keep you any longer. Thank you so much. I know that we've got other questions and thoughts. We can send them to Rosemarie, and Rosemarie can collect them all and send them on to you. Is that an invitation?
Yeah, just feel free to reach out if I can be of any use. If you're, you know, I just put my email in the chat, and if I can be of any help at all, you know, I'm mainly useful just for connecting you with other people who actually know it, who are more kind of practically minded and who are doing the work on the ground. So if I can be of any use in helping to matchmake, I always love doing that.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, friends, this has been a wonderful 2 hours here. They've already flown by, so we've given us a lot to think about, and we'll be in touch. Thank you again, Nathan, for
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Really an honor to be with you.
We'll look forward to reading your piece. That'll be really exciting.
Right. Goodbye.
Okay.
Bye. Thank you.
So do we have any other items that we need to address, or I think we're okay?
Yeah, unless no one else has questions. I think Aaron covered everything in the beginning, right? Please sign up if you haven't already. And great to hear like Stephen and your congregation, you know, ready to move, like let's talk, and great ideas. So we're excited, and we look forward to our next discussion on September 24th.
That's right. We'll be in touch via email with more readings and next step. I think we've got Dr. Stephen Payne coming with us, and Juan Floyd Thomas will be presenting.
Right, and it's a different time, right? It's, I think, I don't have it in front of me, but I don't think it's like from 9 to 11, I believe. Yeah, so just note that it's a Thursday, I believe. Thursday, and it's 9 to 11.
That's right, yes. Thursday from 9 to 11. I'm just looking. I had, that was wrong on the agenda. My apologies. But yeah, good. Okay, thank you all.
Yeah, thanks. Bye.
Rosemary, do you want to debrief or anything, or do you feel good?